Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited about today's webinar. We're going to give everyone just another moment to join, but we'll get started in just a minute. Thank you all so much for joining us. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited to talk about this incredible topic, and we're going to get started just one more moment. I'm still seeing quite a few people coming in and joining us, so we'll give everyone just one more moment to join. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We'll go ahead and get started now. Welcome everyone. My name is Allison Weiss, and I'm the Associate Director of Corporate and Executive Education at the Brown School of Professional Studies. At the Brown School of Professional Studies, our mission is to equip you with the tools, resources, skills, and network that you need to change the way the world works for good. And the way that we achieve this mission is by creating programming that ranges from master's degrees to certificate programs to short courses to these free one-hour masterclasses like this one today that fit into your busy schedule that are on in-demand topics that will help you advance your career and help you change the way that your team, your organization, and your industry works for better results and more humane outcomes. We are so glad that you're here today to learn with us and to learn about us. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day, and if you're on the East Coast during your lunch break, to join us for today's incredible topic. And I am so excited about this. Right before we started this webinar, Tony and I were talking about how much we both love this movie. And something that I was reflecting on as we were preparing for this talk is that Barbie was an unexpected hit of the year in so many ways. Its success took people by surprise. And for a lot of people, I think they think it's kind of lightning in a bottle, could never be duplicated. But in fact, what I have learned from Tony and what you're all about to learn is that there are a lot of lessons that we can learn, capture, and replicate in our own spheres of influence that will help us become better marketers or self-promoters or decision makers and replicate some of the success that Barbie has had. And so with that, I'm very pleased to get to introduce to you today's incredible speaker, Tony Weisman. Tony Weisman is the former Chief Marketing Officer of the Dunkin Brands. Prior to that, he spent a decade at Digitas, including as CEO of North America. He is the board of directors for a lot of companies. It's incredible. I don't know how you do it, including Clavio, which is the organization that has brought him to New York City in this beautiful view today. And most importantly to us, he is also a Brown alum, and we are so pleased that he has come back to share his wisdom with us. And with one last housekeeping note, and I'll turn things over to you, Tony, which is if you have a question, please submit it at any time. We have a lot of people on today's call, which thank you. It's very exciting for us to see. And so I expect the question volume to be really high. And so I'm going to do my best to get to as many questions as possible and to combine questions to be able to answer as many of yours as possible. So if you have a question at any time, please click on the bottom bar of Zoom, click on the Q&A button, and type and submit your questions there, and I'll be monitoring them throughout today's presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to you, Tony. Thank you and welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Alyssa. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And I really want to thank the Brown School of Professional Studies for asking me to do this today. I'm a very proud alum of Brown. My wife went to Brown. I have a son who went to Brown. I live in Narragansett, Rhode Island right now. So big fan and very proud of all the work that the school is doing. As Alyssa mentioned, even though I live in Rhode Island, I'm very lucky to be in Manhattan today on this glorious day for a board meeting that's brought me here. And I appreciate you spending the time today to have this conversation, and it will be a conversation. I'm going to go through what I think are the top 10 lessons from the marketing campaign behind Barbie, and leave plenty of time to get your input and have conversation at the end. If you've not yet seen the Barbie movie, I don't know why that's possible, but I sure hope you run out and see it soon. If you have seen the movie or seen it multiple times, maybe some of what we're going to discuss today will inspire you to see it again. Barbie is a phenomenon. Barbie Barbie is a movie that has already grossed $1.4 billion. It is already the highest grossing film in the 100-year history of Warner Brothers Studios. Greta Gerwig, the director, is the first woman in history to helm a billion-dollar movie. This movie has been rocket fuel for the Mattel company, whose stock is up 20% since the movie launched. And in the words of CEO Ynon Kreiz, is a milestone moment as the Mattel company pivots from being a toy company to a company with intellectual property. They are receiving 5% of the gross, or already $125 million in royalties from this film. And Mattel has 12 other properties in movie development. You might say, well, Barbie's a phenomenon. Margot Robbie's a big star. This is a no-brainer. And in fact, it wasn't. This movie was in development for 14 years and bounced around between a bunch of studios. There was no certainty that it was going to enjoy the success that it has enjoyed. In fact, there's a graveyard full of movie flops based on toys. The G.I. Joe movie, My Little Pony. In fact, just last month, the latest installment of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise bombed, doing half of what Barbie did that same weekend in Barbie's 4th weekend in release. So the question we're going to talk about today is, how did Warner Brothers marketing create the anticipation, the interest, the attendance, and repeat attendance among such a broad variety of moviegoers, men, women, boys, and girls? And while this is marketing focused, what we're going to talk about today really is more about decision making, the choices and strategies that the team made that led to that success, which was anything but certain. So whether you work in marketing or not, my hope here today is to give you what I see as the lessons of really savvy decision making, a lot of honest assessment, a lot of candor, and a lot of bold choices that'll help you make better decisions, regardless of industry, product, or customer target. So what did Barbie do? Barbie got men to dress in pink to bring their daughters to the movies. Not a small feat. Men and women, boys and girls, people of all kinds, not only went to the movie, but dressed up as part of it, shared the experience, and enthusiastically told their friends that this was something for them. A movie that you might have originally thought was really only going to be for women of a certain age who grew up with fond feelings of Barbie. What we're going to unpack today are the choices, the decisions that this team made, the strategies that they employed to generate this level of anticipation and success. Strategy to me is a very important word, and a strategy is simple. It is a point of view you could take both sides of. If you cannot argue a strategy, it's an observation. You have to be able to develop crisp points of view, articulate them in your strategies, and be able to argue on behalf of that with someone who takes the opposite point of view. That's really the key here. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about some of those choices that they made. To begin with, what Greta Gerwig did was to create a Barbie movie that was a hero's journey for Barbie. Not a natural choice, but a brilliant one. What she did was to confront the realities of how Barbie is perceived today. Very honestly, Barbie is polarizing, is credited with creating a lot of issues for women and girls around body image, self-awareness, body positivity, etc. And to many people feels like an outdated icon. The movie builds to this critical moment when America Ferrera gives this speech. She talks about the impossible demands that women face. You have to never get old, never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, never fall down, never fail, never show fear, never get out of line. It's too hard. It's too contradictory. That's the essential thesis that the movie takes, confronting the realities and bringing them into sharp focus toward the end under the guise of America. The genius of this choice was to understand and validate the powerful mixed feelings that people have about Barbie. As one woman said, we loved her, idolized her, chopped off her hair, made fun of her, and felt a little icky about the stereotypes and gender roles she represents. Clear strategy, clear point of view, not an easy thing for Mattel to agree to, but importantly, the difference that took this movie from being interesting to being a blockbuster. So here are my 10 lessons, and I hope they inspire you. At the end of each one, I'll provide the insight that I think it shares. I'll recap them at the end, and then we can have a chat. The first, be brave. Bravery is highly underestimated in marketing and decision-making. And it starts with an honest assessment of where the brand stands today. And you have to be very clear and visible about your weaknesses. A global study of brands I love had Lego at 82% and Barbie at 52%, a meaningful gap. This is where the brand started, understanding its weakness, understanding it had lost relevance for today's girls. The insight that we all have to start with is to confront the uncomfortable truths. The second lesson, create a compelling brief. Most of the times when I see a brief, it's really a description of the problem, a series of observations, a discussion about the complexities facing us. That's not what a brief is. A brief's really the first ad. It's the way you start creating a point of view. As Alyssa mentioned, I used to be the chief marketing officer for Dunkin'. You're certainly familiar with the line, America runs on Dunkin'. America runs on Dunkin' was the brief. It was the point of view that the strategists came up with and the creatives couldn't beat. And it's become the line that's famous with the brand. You start by knowing the barriers to participation. The team that marketed this movie knew those barriers to participation, knew they were strongly felt, knew that there were powerful ambivalent feelings, which generated this tagline that they marketed the movie under. If you love Barbie, this movie is for you. If you hate Barbie, this movie is for you. Talk about guts. Talk about putting it right on the line. A brilliant line summarizing a brilliant point of view. And that translated into swagger. Everything they did marketing this brand assumed that everyone wanted to see it. So don't start working until you get the brief right. 3, big challenge for a lot of businesses, avoid nostalgia. It's like amber. It'll freeze you in the past. Many brands, companies, and businesses are fearful about evolving. The truth is your customers are more ready than you think. Your prospects are ready for you to evolve, to modernize. Barbie is very much a movie for our time right now. So I like to say the insight, respect the past, but live in the present. Lesson 4, trust the talent. Greta Gerwig was an inspired choice, a masterstroke to helm this movie. In today's marketing world, what I see a lot of is a flipping of a traditional paradigm. It used to be when you looked at a marketing budget, you spent a small amount of money on the content, the creative, the production, sometimes referred to as below the line, and a lot of money for distribution, generally in the form of paid media. That's switched today. Organic growth on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, et cetera, makes distribution low cost, frankly, even close to free. What a lot of brands are doing is making the mistake of keeping the content costs low and thinking the whole thing is just cheaper. When instead, what we need to be doing is investing in the talent to create great content. And the truth is, as has always been the case, great talent deserves a premium price and creates superior content. A masterstroke to hire Greta, a master stroke to let her guide and to follow her instincts. Number 5, inclusivity is essential. DEI in a lot of places is often considered checking the box, not for this film and not for the way it was marketed. There is broad representation in the movie itself and in the marketing that invites everyone to join the party. It is a big tent. It's very inclusive. Everything about the way this movie was marketed says to anybody and everybody, come on in. And it starts with a great cast of both men and women, trans, people of color, body positive, all of which manifests itself in the marketing. And it proves to us that inclusivity is not just a good to do, or not just a nice to have or check the box, but is essential from the start. Lesson 6, build anticipation. This is a scene that you may have seen from when Margot and Ryan shot the rollerblade film in early spring at Venice Beach in Santa Monica. They didn't clear the area and bring in extras. They actually went out there and shot it in the real world, generating millions of impressions of people who saw this happening and posted it. They made it easy to go viral, and the buzz began. This is the look of the film. These are the colors. These are the stars. There's going to be a scene with them rollerblading. They began building this in anticipation more than 4 months before the movie released. And relatedly, in the same place, they created a world of Barbie in Santa Monica that opened 3 months before the movie did. This was a paid admission to walk into this world that had been created on film and represented in a physical space in Santa Monica. Got a lot of press coverage, generated a lot of impressions 3 months before anybody could do anything about it, before anybody could go and see the film. The insight that I like to share here is, regardless of the project you're working on, regardless of the brand, the product, the event, think like a movie release and think about a calendar of planned activities well in advance of when you are bringing whatever you are bringing into the world. What it does is it lets consumers, prospects, internal audiences be a part of spreading the news, of creating anticipation, even though in many cases, there's nothing they can do about it for months. And I think the genius here was to be very transparent about the look and feel of the movie, not to keep it under wraps by any stretch, but to invite people to participate in it and get excited along with the studio in its eventual opening. Lesson 7, OPM, other people's money. This was one of the keys to the Barbie marketing success, were the collaborations, known as collabs, and in this case became known as Barbie Core, a whole subculture of partnerships with the movie. This is one of my favorites. This is the Malibu Dream House in Malibu, California. The studio did a partnership with Airbnb. Airbnb listed this property. It is now the most popular listing in Airbnb history. Airbnb's marketing muscle, tremendous reach, amplified this physical creation of something quite endemic to the Barbie brand. More interestingly, was an unusual media partnership with Architectural Digest, in which Margot Robbie did a video walkthrough tour of the Dream House. Now that makes sense, but you might have thought, well, that belongs in People magazine, for example. Architectural Digest, an unusual and brilliant masterstroke, an upscale brand known for taking you into homes where you really want to see what's on the inside. If you haven't watched this video, I encourage you to do so. Generated a tremendous amount of interest in the Dream House and positioned Barbie as a premium brand among this audience that are big fans of Arch Digest. I'm guessing many of you saw the commercials that Progressive Insurance ran. And it's easy to think, well, let's use Progressive's massive media budget, put them in the set and shoot a commercial. But the genius here, and the thing to really think about when it comes to your own collaborations, is, are you strategically aligned? So Progressive's key strategy is to take its auto insurance customers and have them add home insurance as well. This kind of bundling leads to stickiness, leads to greater long-term value, and is their fundamental business strategy. So it was a natural to shoot this commercial at the Barbie dream house. Progressive put a lot of media behind it, but this was a very careful choice on the studio's part. And the thing to think about when it comes to collaborations is there a natural strategic alignment? Just because somebody has money doesn't make them a good partner. There are a raft of others. I'll show you a few that I thought were particularly creative. Crocs, very clever. If you're not aware, and I'm guessing many of you are, Crocs is having an incredible resurgence. This is a brilliant brand to partner with. These products sold quite quickly and had an incredible hipness to them, feeling very much of the moment. Same with the pink Doc Martens. And what's great about these two is they focus on feet. And if you haven't seen the movie, I won't spoil it. And if you have, you know that Barbie's heels are an important part of the story. Barbie Xbox. Probably not the first collaboration you would have thought of, but a perfect fit for what we might call STEM Barbie. A brilliant way of demonstrating the breadth of appeal. And in fact, as Barbie points out a lot in the movie, STEM is much more important to her now than when she first came on the scene. Balmain. Let's call this disposable income Barbie. This pink hoodie is $1,350. And you can see from Crocs to this hoodie, a strategic and intentional broad range of consumer products, price points, and interest levels that demonstrates, once again, breadth and inclusivity. All the way down to a very inexpensive, but very, very visible product in grocery stores, the Barbie Swoon drink. It's a new brand. They benefited from the attention and the relevance of this product as a zero sugar soda was very relevant to the themes that Barbie puts forward in the film. Here's the key with collabs. Make sure they're selective. They are multipliers of your own budget. But I ask you to think about, and this is a fun exercise for us to do, what are the ones the studio rejected? Because there were a lot they rejected. And we sometimes lose sight of that when we just admire the outcome of the collabs and instead say, again, what point of view did this brand have and how did it make sense to work with some and not others? Lesson 8 is the importance of graphics. This is a Hollywood billboard, unlike any that's ever been put up in Hollywood. It's pink and all it says is July 21. In today's smartphone, social media driven, TikTok, Instagram, Snap world, graphics matter more than copy. People are seeing tens of thousands of images a day. They're not reading as much copy as they used to. Graphics matter. It does not matter what business you're in. Think about the graphics. Think about communicating graphically, simply, and easily. Now, Greta Gerwig and her team looked at more than 100 shades of pink before landing on this one, and then made sure that every collaboration, every ad, every marketing material was this pink. So if you're going to go graphic and you're going to do collabs, consistency matters. Wherever it shows up in the world, it's an extension of your brand. So specify the PMS, the font, the tone. Be rigorous in specifying that with any partner you work with so that wherever it ends up in the world, it's consistent. The next lesson, inspire virality. Virality, going viral, doesn't just happen. It has to be inspired and can be done very thoughtfully and very cleverly. We've all heard the term UGC, user-generated content. Just because we want people to post doesn't mean they're going to. You have to give them reasons, whether they're ordinary folks or celebrities. So they did. What I consider to be among the smartest things the studio did was to create the Barbie selfie generator. I'm guessing some of you used it and shared it. This was an extremely simple site. where you could simply upload a photo of yourself and put yourself into Barbie land. There's an example. Simple, lets the fan own it, but very much in a context that feels like you've created your own movie poster. As you probably saw, a lot of these turned into memes. And these are hilarious. There are hundreds of these. If you haven't seen them, look them up. But how great is this? Free distribution because you started with a very clear idea, a simple way to create them, and it's all on brand. These are two of my favorites. Miss Goop, this Barbie lost half a day of skiing, and he's just Ken. Hilarious and doing the work for the business. This is one of my favorite photos. This is a group that got together and booked a theater in Austin, Texas, all wore pink cowboy hats, and all went to the movie together. This is not a random selfie. This was a staged photo. So what these fans did was participate in the marketing of the film because they were inspired to do so. And this is the kind of user-generated content that you want to create. What I love is just finding random photos of people who wore pink to the movie and shared it. Again, that identity of inclusivity, everybody is welcome here, is what leads to people feeling like it's not just a movie I went to or told my friends. I wanted to share the fact that I treated it like an event, got dressed in pink. And if you look at these in the wild, you'll find a broad range of people who did this. A boat operator in Boston created a Barbie boat cruise. Simple to license, simple to approve. And on this day, 3 weeks before the movie opened, you could wear your Barbie core, play your favorite music, bring whatever pink you had, and go on a boat cruise. I'd never seen this done before. I think it's very clever. Some of you are obviously clearly fans of the movie and the soundtrack. You may be aware that Lizzo's Giddy label introduced a summer dollhouse collection linked to the song Pink that she sings in the movie. So you have ordinary fans. You also have celebrities who are connected to the project, getting behind it and amplifying it. And of course, they have massive reach, just like Kim Kardashian did in this pink outfit. This is behind her Alan Newey collaboration and her new drink called Kimade. How do you inspire virality? You got to think about it. It doesn't just happen. You have to invite consumers to own the brand as much as you do. Often I have found this is a big challenge. You got to let go. You got to let them in. You got to let them make it their own, which means setting some guidelines, setting some brand parameters, but letting people run with it. This generated millions and millions of dollars in earned media, generating excitement for the opening and repeat viewing. The last lesson I'll share is don't take yourself too seriously. This may be easier said than done. One of the brilliant things that the film did, which can teach us a great lesson, is the first half of the film is really very playful. We're having fun in Barbie World. We're also having a little bit of fun at her and Ken's expense. It's lighthearted, it's cheeky, and we realize that it's kind of goofy. That puts us at ease. We relax a bit because in the second half of the film, Greta delivers the thesis. The one that we talked about at the beginning comes in a number of ways, but notably in the way that America Ferrera sums it up. And the reality here is the film embraces the cringiness so that we are open-minded to the key message. The same goes for everything we're doing in the marketing world. Don't take yourself too seriously. It will invite people to lean in and smile and ultimately be more open to your key message. So those are my 10 lessons. Hopefully you found some inspiration in some of them. Hopefully there are some ideas that you have coming out of this. Be brave. It's underestimated, it's critical. And confront difficult truths. Don't start until you have a compelling brief that really has a sharp point of view. Avoid nostalgia. Live in the modern moment. Trust the talent. They will create superior content. Inclusivity is essential. Build anticipation. Way before it's, quote, launch time, build that in anticipation. Do collaborations with other people's money, but only the ones that really fit with what your strategy is. Graphics, critical, more important than copy. Inspire virality, let people own the brand, and ultimately, don't take yourself too seriously. I hope there's some nuggets in here that are helpful to you. As we said, we're going to leave plenty of time for commentary, questions, and dialogue. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tony. This was incredible. And I just want you to know that in addition to some really great questions that we do have in the Q&A field, and I'm excited to give them to you, we also have a lot of notes of thank you and people saying that they thought your presentation was absolutely incredible. So thank you for all of the time and the work and thought you put into this. And so we will transition now into Q&A, and we have a lot of great questions for you. And if you have not yet submitted your question, please feel free to do so by clicking on the bottom bar of Zoom and typing it into the Q&A field. So the first question that I have for you is, how do you think Mattel can keep up the anticipation and apply the same marketing techniques for its other toy products they plan to make films on? Or do you think it will become overdone and people's excitement won't go past Barbie?
I believe they are going to be successful, and for several reasons. Ynon Kreiz, who is the CEO, comes out of the entertainment world, really understands Hollywood, and really understands how to build partnerships. It was his idea to solicit Greta to direct it. He was very involved, and he was the one who made a lot of key decisions, like letting the film poke fun at Mattel. So I trust Ynon to go at a good pace. It's a very good question because if you look at Hollywood and you look at the sequels and you look at the franchises, you can argue that just about every one of them has probably jumped the shark at some point. But what I think will make the difference here is that I don't think Ynon will greenlight any project until he's completely confident that he has the right director, the right strategy, the right approach. They're still a toy company. They still have to create lots of toys and sell lots of toys around the world. So it's not essential for the future of the business that every one of them, that they do too many of them, I should say. It's a good watch out. And as anybody who has ever done a sequel, it could be nerve-wracking. But my money is on Ynon, and I'm hoping the next one is The Godfather 2, which is, by many people's estimation, as good or better than the original.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And actually had a tie into Barbie too, the Godfather series.
Exactly.
A related question is, how do you think Mattel will apply your point on the importance of inclusivity to its other toys that they plan to make movies on, like Thomas the Train?
It's a great question. I think it is fair to say that over time, Mattel has been slow to adapt inclusivity in their toy line. There were, interestingly enough, early on, there were a handful of evolutions of Barbie that were inclusive, but not enough and not fast enough. And what I'm betting is that the reception to this film and its inclusivity, from the casting to the marketing to the soundtrack, et cetera, will inspire the toy designers and the future owners of these franchises to realize that they have work to do, that they have to catch up, that they have been slow to really embrace full inclusivity. And my guess is that they're spending a lot of time right now unpacking the lessons from this movie. And one of them is it's just not okay to move slowly on this anymore. So I think you're going to see them become a very modern brand, a very modern series of toy lines and franchises sooner than later.
Thank you. And that ties so nicely. There are several questions about timing. And so I'm going to jump over to those because of what you just said.
Sure.
One person asked, what are your thoughts on those who are late to the party? Do you think that there's a time frame for jumping in on a trend like this? For example, if we were to try to figure out a way for our brand to engage in Barbie now, is it too late or should we still do it?
If you're asking specifically about Barbie, it's too late. I think, I hate to say it, but at this point, I mean, Barbie will still do decent box office. It's already started to migrate to the Amazon streaming platform. It will continue to get views and will top out at over 2 billion in global sales. But the heat behind it is gone. And so if it's a collaboration that's interesting to you, I would encourage you to pick the next one.
Thank you. Another person asked about building anticipation. What is the right timing, planning, and to release content to keep the anticipation alive?
Well, there's no one right answer, but I would say in general, it's sooner than you think. Let me give you a little context. For decades, the big CPG consumer packaged goods businesses like Procter & Gamble and Colgate-Palmolive and Unilever had a development cycle that would usually run 2 to 3 years in a lab and then launch in a day the upgraded, newly minted version of Crest or Dove or what have you. And what we've seen in the last couple decades is a very interesting change to that created by the software business. Software launches in beta. And what software tells the world is, this is as far as we got it. It's not perfect. We welcome your input. And the more traditional marketers started to realize there's an expression that a lot of the software companies use, which is fail fast, which is if we get out sooner and we get input sooner, we will be given permission for having not have been perfect, but we will engender interest and engagement because people will feel like I can help you get this better. That's my way of saying the context is go sooner. Go sooner. We'll go sooner than you have traditionally, and maybe even than you're comfortable. And take an attitude of, what do you think? This is where we're at, but we welcome your input. It's very welcoming, whereas the traditional model was not welcoming. It's, we've perfected it. We've tested it over and over and over. Ta-da. That's not how people think these days. And particularly if you spend any time on social media, you will see where there's a thought that many people think guide the way social media is done, which is first thought, best thought. It's spontaneous, it's authentic, it's not highly edited. That is where people's expectations are. So I encourage you to go sooner than you think. You don't have to maintain intense levels of anticipation for 3-6 months. Spikes are fine. Spikes of, hey, 6 months out we did this, 3 months out we did this, a month we did this. That's fine. All of which will be cumulative so that when you are in market, there will be anticipation, there'll be some heightened interest, and there may be a little criticism. There may be a little, I wish they had done this, I wish they had done that. That's okay. That's engagement, because the attitude you put out in the world is, we welcome your input, as opposed to not.
Thank you. We have 2 questions that are about the impact that celebrity involvement had with the success of the film, and I'm going to combine them into one, but they're kind of about 2 ends of the spectrum. One end is Margot Robbie, wearing all the Barbie pink on the red carpet and really being emblematic of Barbie in her public appearances. And then the other side of the coin is Lizzo encountering a lot of public scrutiny and scandal as the film was coming out. So can you talk a little bit about how both of those ends of the spectrum of celebrity involvement with the movie impacted its marketing and its success?
Sure. Importantly, Margot not only starred in the movie, but she was a producer. And she benefited commercially from the success of the film. So you saw her on a lot of runways and a lot of premieres around the world, not only because she, quote, had to be there, and not because the studio flew her in and forced her to be there, but because she wanted to be there, because it was good for her commercially. And she was, I think you're going to see more of that going forward. You have a number of big stars today who do have producer roles. It's not something that a lot of stars have done, but I think more will do. So I think what you saw Margot Robbie doing essentially was going above and beyond what she was contracted to do or forced to do or asked to do by the studio. Let's go to the Lizzo point. If you're going to collaborate with a celebrity, you are collaborating with the totality of that person. Okay. And almost certainly there will be controversy at some point. To be fair, some of these celebrities have hundreds of millions of followers, in part because they generate controversy. They generate that level of interest. I think that the best way to do it is to have the sort of face-to-face personal connection and say, here's what we're trying to do. We want to understand if your values and attitude are in line with this. And, we're not going to control you. You cannot get anywhere if you say, I need to review every post or every conversation. That's not going to happen. But are we fundamentally aligned, and do we fundamentally want the same things? Now, there are going to be times when you're going to have to embrace discomfort, because there are some celebrities who just enjoy pushing the envelope and sometimes pushing against the very brand that they're working with. You have to accept some of that to a point. We've all seen examples recently where certain celebrities have said incredibly inappropriate, incredibly incriminating, and just things that cannot be withstood. And those relationships end. I think the key is go into it with an open mind, know that some things may make you uncomfortable, but if it gets to a point where your partner says or does something that is just vile or hateful or absolutely something you cannot stand, you immediately have to take up a stand. We saw that with Adidas. I think where brands get in trouble is when they vacillate. Okay. And you have to know what you stand for, and you have to know your values, and you have to know what you kind of go, yeah, a little okay, and absolutely no way. And when you get to that point of no way, you have to be firm and say, we do not support this, regardless of the consequences. That's the trade-off when you partner with someone who has 150 million followers on Instagram.
Absolutely. Yep. A lot of reach to do good and a lot of reach to do damage. The next question for you is, how can I utilize these 10 lessons that you have, distilled so nicely for building a personal brand?
I would say most of them are highly applicable. Let's say, for example, are you being really honest about the challenges? Are you being very honest about what the barriers are to participation? You want to sort of ask yourself, in any conversation that we're having, is there as much conversation in the room about how this is awesome and how excited we are and how terrific this is going to be, as here's a barrier, here's why people don't like us, here's some of the concerns that are in the world? Just ask yourself, in the course of any conversation, is it 50-50? And if it's not, you're going to have a problem. That doesn't mean you don't do it. In my observations over time, it is often the person who brings up the how about or what about or this worries me who gets stifled and gets told and gets perceived as not on board or not on the team. Absolutely wrong. You want to be the person in the room who says, we're only going to succeed if we're aware of these. We're only going to succeed if we confront whatever those challenges are. So I think that, when you talk about being brave and have a compelling brief, et cetera, I think those are relevant. I particularly think trusting the talent is key. So who's the talent? Is the talent the person? Great. That could be fabulous. Does the talent exist? Is there really storytelling? Is there really narrative? We could do a whole nother conversation on narrative. Narrative is simple storytelling. And I think we've all probably sat through way too many PowerPoints that were essentially boring and flat and had no narrative to them. If you can't create a narrative, or if the talent you're working with cannot create a narrative that has a beginning, middle, and an end, has an arc, then you need to stop. And I think regardless of whether it's regardless of the kind of brand, you have to be able to articulate what that narrative is and understand it and get behind it.
Yeah. Next question is around intellectual property. So they're talking about how, in light of the writer's strike, it's bringing up a lot of conversations about the appropriate piece of the corporate profit margin pie. So how do we as intellectual property creators come out on top in this new world order?
Well, it's a complicated question. The strikes that are playing out in Hollywood right now really reflect a dramatically changing business model. And, I think that it's very difficult to appreciate just how much this model is changing and how everyone's going to benefit from it. I'm optimistic that the writer's strike in particular is going to be solved relatively soon, because I think they're starting to have real conversations with one another, but it has dragged on for 4 months. And I think the reason it's dragged on is because it's not really clear who the enemies are here. I mean, I think the writers are very clear that the studio heads are the enemies, the CEOs could be paid a lot of money, whereas there are plenty of writers and members of SAG who are, very famous movie stars making, hundreds of millions of dollars. And the real, quote, issues here have to do with, how does streaming actually factor in the future to the way in which creators, writers are compensated. Streamers have to date been opaque about the audiences. And, I think it'd be better for all, personally, if they were more transparent about views and audience engagement, et cetera, because a lot of the residuals and a lot of the relationships in these contracts in the past have been built on transparency around viewership. I think that you've got this looming issue of AI that nobody's really sure if this is going to be a help or a hindrance. It's too early in AI's development for anybody to really understand how to monetize it, how to limit it, what its role is and isn't going to be. I think that's a level of complexity that we're going to have to deal with in the future. In general, the issue surrounding content creation, let's call it in Hollywood, is that until recently, there were 550 original scripted television programs in production. How many of you have turned on the TV at night and said, there's so much, but there's nothing I want to watch? Or I don't really know what to watch. And then you go out to dinner with friends like, oh, you got to watch The Bear. By the way, I love The Bear on Hulu. This market can no longer support that much original production. That's one of the problems. The second is the Charter Disney deal reveals that the dynamics between the distribution and the content creators, in this case, Disney and Charter, is going to change. And so you're dealing with sort of three-dimensional chess. Okay, we've got to produce less. We have to find more affordable ways to do it. We absolutely have to pay the people who create the talent and pay them fairly, not just for the first, but for subsequent airings. And all of this needs to be reimagined. In general, strikes are not the best way to reimagine relationships because there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of ill will. My hope is that they'll all get around a table together and sort of think about a new model for going forward. Creators have to get paid or else they're going to go do something else and we'll all be the poorer for it. And, the studios need to get a decent return on their money. And ultimately, I might try to park the AI issue for a while and come back to it, because I think we're just in the first inning of understanding the impact of AI.
Thank you. A couple people noted a little bit of surprise at the point of avoiding nostalgia when it comes to a property like Barbie. And so they ask, what is the key in bridging nostalgia to modernity in the case of something like Barbie?
Well, it's a fine line. I don't really think anything about the movie was necessarily nostalgic, and it may have to do with how I define nostalgic. I think nostalgic is very much an attitude of it used to be better when, things were better when. I wish I wish things were like they were then. I think it feels more backward looking than forward looking, and I think it feels like better times were behind us and that kind of thing. And I think what it would have manifested itself in this movie as glorifying Barbie in her earliest incarnations. I don't think the movie glorifies early Barbie. I think it has fun with her. I think it's quirky. I think there's great laughs in it. But I don't, if you think about, and again, I'll ruin this for those who have not seen it. So the very first conversation Barbie has with a young girl when she enters the modern world, the girl is like, I haven't played with that. I mean, it was very direct. It's very harsh. And it's very much about your time is over. So I think just because Barbie's been around a long time doesn't mean that they treated it with nostalgia. I think nostalgia is a very specific kind of treatment that, in my opinion, can be very harming, because I think it assumes that what worked before works now, that it assumes that the context hasn't changed. It assumes that all we need to do is recreate the magic we had before. But I don't think that's a genuine testament to the people who created in the past. So even I don't mistake the fact that Barbie has been around for a long time for nostalgia. I think nostalgia would have felt different. It would have felt like a documentary highlighting the glory of the woman who created the Barbie for her daughter and named it after her daughter. All those stories came out in the press around the history of Barbie, but that's not what the movie's about. And the movie doesn't want you to go back to that, quote, simpler time. What the movie wants you to do is say, boy, the world passed her by. And, as a hero's journey, she could either lament it or evolve. And so that to me is when you say, I think the fine line is don't trash the past. I don't think that's fair. I don't think you get anywhere by saying that was wrong. I think you get somewhere by saying it had its moment, it was right for its time, and we respect that, but we're all about the now. And that to me is how you thread that line.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We've also gotten a couple of questions about how do I apply these lessons if I am a small business rather than a big company?
I think in many ways the same way. I did make a lot of references to Mattel's a big global corporation, so that's the genesis here. Let's take a few of them and think them through. So for example, other people's money and collaborations, probably less interesting if you're a small business or you're early stage and people don't necessarily know who you are. I get that, and that's fine. But I do think you can take some of the lessons about bravery. What's the bravest way you can enter the market? What's the most courageous thing you can say? What's the thing that makes you a little bit nervous? What is it about the product or service or the offering that has edge to it? Being nondescript is a recipe for disaster. This is not a world that embraces ordinary or purely functional, absent a narrative and a storyline and an idea. So be bold, be brave about what your ambitions are, how you're going to change the world, and how you see that. Articulate it. There's a lot of ways you can articulate it. You can write a post on Medium. You can post it on LinkedIn. You can be very, very brave about why you exist, what you see is your mission in the world, your purpose, to go back to Alyssa's point at the beginning about what school is about. What is your purpose and why do you have a right to win? I think it is underestimated how important it is to, not just because we built it or because we think it's good or because customers, what is our right to win? And articulate it and do it in compelling, fresh prose that pops off the page, graphically pops off. To the extent that you can afford talent and it requires paying for them, pay for them. If not, find a way to collaborate with them. What is talent in this case? Talent is storytellers, talented filmmakers, poets, artists, singers, etc. People who can amplify your story. Sometimes in early stage businesses, that's in exchange for equity or involvement in the creation of the brand. I mean, you see now Pharrell is the creative director for Louis Vuitton. What does that bring them? It brings them not just his taste, which is quite good, but he amplifies what, he's bringing his own amplification. Again, I don't mean to use only big brands, but people who have a skill set of telling a story and amplifying it can become partners, even if you're not actually paying them. in cash and it might be an equity-based relationship. I think regardless of the size of the business, regardless of the product or service, do not take yourself too seriously. It's easier said than done, but it will engender empathy and engagement and happiness, which is a lot more fun for people to then lean in and figure out what you're up to.
Thank you. The next question is, a lot of the anticipation for this movie was wrapped up in the Barbieheimer meme. I've now seen people try to connect other movies opening up on the same day in a similar fashion. How important was this dual opening weekend to the success of the movie? And do you think anything could be captured like that again?
Yeah, there's a corollary to a lot of this, which is sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. And the Barbenheimer was good luck. It was neither film's ingoing assumption. It was never the studios wanting to be, well, one's for the women, one's for the guys, one's up, one's down, that was not the intention. They were released at the same time because the studios just assumed that there was not a lot of overlap in the viewing audience, which is how releases are often scheduled. It had something to do with, you may or may not have followed this, a little inside baseball, but a few weeks before these movies launched, Tom Cruise's latest Mission Impossible launched. And you may be aware that Christopher Nolan, who is the director of Oppenheimer, wanted the film to be seen in IMAX, and he retrofit studio theaters around the country to 70 millimeter IMAX because he shot it in IMAX. And Tom got upset because that meant that Mission Impossible was going to be pulled out of certain IMAX theaters to make room for Oppenheimer. And he got a little angry about it. And unfortunately, he was a little publicly angry about it. And he faced immediate backlash for seeming to not support fellow artists. And so he got behind Barbenheimer. And he quickly did a 180 and he said, that wasn't what I meant. And I'm thrilled that Oppenheimer's going to be in IMAX. And and he picked up the meme Barbenheimer, which gave it a lot of juice. My wife and I did that. We did it on consecutive days. And it was kind of a fun thing. I would say that's lightning in a bottle. I never advise people to try to catch good luck. And that was just really good luck. Frankly, most industry analysts think it helped Oppenheimer a lot more than it helped Barbie. But what it did in general was get people back to theaters, get people excited about theaters. I don't know that anybody believes that this is going to resuscitate the movie theater business long-term, given, the growth of streaming and the availability of a lot of content in your home. But for a moment, it was one of the things that I liked most about Barbenheimer was all these crowds of people post the worst parts of COVID gathering together like we used to in a common place where we had absolutely nothing in common as people, but other coming together for a shared activity. And for a moment, it sort of felt like the mood of the country elevated because for a moment we were all back together, remembering what life was like 3 years ago, where we could have these shared experiences. And I think that we should celebrate that moment, but I wouldn't plan on it happening again.
Thank you. That's really inspiring. And I really resonate with that. I felt that too when I went. We only have time for one more question, which is too bad. We have a lot of really great ones. Thank you all for your thoughtful questions that you submitted. But the last question was asked a couple of times, so I'll choose this one, which is, how do you personally stay on top of trends? And are there specific literature or tools that you recommend that this group check out to be able to increase their own skill set in marketing?
Great question. I have always had several strategies for that. One, I have kids, and they're very good about telling me what's what. I have always adopted new social media platforms at the beginning, just to sort of see what's going on. So I'm a daily TikTok user, as well as a number of other platforms where I find it very interesting to sort of engage in the platform itself, but also see what's going on. I tend to ask a lot of questions when I meet people. I tend to try to figure out what they're into. And I think listening is really important when it comes to that. In terms of what I read, there are a number of writers. Rex Woodbury is one who I think is a terrific tech writer. I listen to a number of podcasts, things like Pivot that I think are cover tech pretty well. Ann Helen Peterson is a writer who I like to follow. The thing I like about her blog is the links at the end that tend to send me places that I wouldn't otherwise go. I would say that if I had to give you one piece of advice, whether you're on X, Threads, wherever, follow people you wouldn't ordinarily follow, and then follow their links. And you will definitely go down a rabbit hole, and time will have passed and you won't have noticed it, but you'll discover something you didn't know.
That's an incredible note to end on. Thank you so much. And thanks to your incredibly concise, but also impactful answers, we actually managed to get through 39 questions. So
holy cow,
congratulations to us. A couple of them were ones I could respond to via typing, but still, it's pretty incredible to see it. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your incredible questions. We will be sending a recording out to everyone who registered for this within 48 hours, so be on the lookout for that. And a couple of people asked the question of where they can learn more about the School Professional Studies programming, and we'd love for you to join us for future programs. So I did put a link to that in the chat. It's just professional.brown.edu, and you can look to see our full range of programs, including these webinars, but also we have short programs, certificate programs, and master's programs to help you develop in-demand skills in a flexible format that works for you. So thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you, Tony. This was incredible. I learned a ton, and now I'm excited to watch Barbie again. I've seen it twice, but now I need to watch it again with this lens on. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You bet, Alyssa. This has been great. Thank you all for your time. Love the questions and the conversation, and really enjoyed being with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.